Okay, so the topic for today is modularization, and you guys might ask yourself, or you might be wondering, why are we bothering with modularization? We've already been kind of doing some different things with Express, with Mongo and Mongoose, and it seems like everything's going fine, right? Let's look at, we'll look real quick at the file that we were working on yesterday. This is just our server.js. And we've got some different things in it. We've got some requires up at the top. We're connecting our Mongoose. We've got our schema, our Dojos schema. And then we've got down here, finally we get to some routing logic. And then down at the bottom, we're listening with our app. So that's all fine and dandy when it's something really small like this. So in this case, we have two routes. We've got one model, and since we've got those two routes, we really only have two route handlers. What if this project got quite a bit bigger? What if we had, I don't know, 20 routes? Or what if we had 5 different models? Does this seem like this would be a sustainable method? Something that we would be able to maintain as it grew and grew? No, this file would become pretty unwieldy pretty quickly. So we'd have a whole bunch of code that we would have to run through just to get to whatever part that we're interested in. And we don't want our stuff to be difficult to read or understand. It's very important that when we come back to this at a later time, it makes sense to us. And where do we want to go to find different things? So the first thing that we're going to talk about, which is crucial for this idea of modularization, is that we need to know how can we know how to require things because we've been doing that. But the other thing that we want to know how to do is how do we export something. So if we're creating our own modular piece of code that we want to bring into some other file, how do we export the thing that we're trying to give to the other file? Has anyone come across this section in the platform yet? How we're going to do that?
Broadcast?
You're thinking of sockets.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that's a totally different thing. Yeah, that's okay. Has anyone gotten to the section where we actually have to export anything?
I haven't gotten the section, but I think I know.
You think you may know how to do it?
Is it like the export default, or are we going to do it differently?
It's going to be slightly different. So export default is something that's generally used for browser-based code. Although I want to make the caveat, export default is something that will be available in future versions of Node. So we're back on 10.16. Eventually what's going to happen is Node code is moving in a direction where we'll be able to use similar directives like that. So export default, all that means, and we'll probably see it later on when we're doing Angular, it just means that this is the main thing that our file is exporting. So by default, we are exporting some object, and that's what export default is.
A lot of this syntax then will only work in Node compiled, so that's why if you're using some of these things, you need to like run it on a server that runs Node instead of directly in the browser.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to run something that has requires in it directly in the browser, although you'd be able to transpile it down to something that the browser would understand. Yeah. So, but what we're going to talk about here is that if I want to, let's just create a new file here just to see how this works. Let's say I'm creating some modular piece of code, and I'll just call it modular. And I want to export, I don't know, an object. So let's just say const object is like this, name Bob. All right. Now I want to give that to some other piece of code, and I want to be able to require it and access this object that I've just created. So there are a couple different ways I can do it. Node gives us this thing called module.exportsObject. Okay, and I can set this to be whatever I want it to be. If I set it to be a string, for instance, what that's going to mean is that this particular file will export that string. Question? No? Okay. Or if it was a number, I would just be exporting a number, and so on and so forth. I can export this object, and that's what we're going to do in this case. So if I go module.exports equals that object, I'm going to be able to require that somewhere else, just like we've been doing with our other requires. So here, when we require code, notice how it's just expressed by itself, nothing else. And what Node is going to do by default is that when we don't provide any pathing in front of these things, it's going to go and look for them in our Node modules folder. Okay? The difference here is that instead of us looking at Node modules for the code that we just exported, we need to look in the correct path to find that file so that Node knows where to look. So if I'm here in my server file, and let me open up my terminal just to make sure that's still running. Okay, so we're still listening to changes. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to require that that file that I just exported something from. So let's say const object equals require. And since this thing is on the same level as what I just exported, so here we're inside the server.js file, and I'm exporting something from modular.js. The way that I'm going to reference it is just using a dot and a slash. Have you guys seen this at all for pathing thus far? Yeah, you have? Dot slash? No? Yeah. Okay, so a little bit here and there. What this means is that the dot just tells us we're at the same level that we're in now, and the slash is just telling us it's some file that's inside of that. Now I can leave off the .js because Node is automatically going to resolve .js files. I can also put it in there too, and it won't hurt anything. I could do modular.js, that would be fine. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to console log this to make sure that we got it. So we go console log object. Okay. And there we go. So we logged Bob down in there. Bob's with us. Okay. If I were to bury this in sort of a deeper directory, what I might do is we'll just say, we'll call this subdir. And then we'll drop modular in here. Notice how we crashed because now it's looking for this. Whoops, hang on one second. It actually changed it for me, but something happened here. Now it's saying modular.js/index.js. So the pathing got messed up. I have this thing set so that if I move things around, it should automatically adjust the paths for me. But obviously, this is not correct. So we want to go into subdir and then just go to modular itself. So we don't want the /.js. So let me just adjust this here. I'll take this off. And we should be okay. So now we got Bob again. All good, right? Does anybody have any questions about how we're doing these exports? There's one other way to do exports that I'll show you real quick. We could do it, instead of saying module.exports equals object, I could do something like exports.object equals object. And if I did it this way, did I still get my Bob? Yeah. So that's one other way that we can export from a file. We can say exports dot a particular property, and I could set that equal to something. Like maybe if I wanted exports dot some name to be a function, I could do it that way. And I could do So the difference between these two approaches is that if you use exports dot something, you can do that multiple times in the file. But if we do module.exports, you're only going to want to do it one time. So module.exports equals object means that is the only thing that we are exporting from this file.
So if you did it the other way and you required it, what would be returned in that object in the other file? Would it be like an array of everything that's being passed, or an object?
So let's take a look here. Exports.object equals object. And now we're actually getting something nested. Are you seeing that there?
Yeah.
Can you see that? Okay. So what happened here is that we exported a property called object, and we set it equal to the object. So rather than us just getting this object by itself when we imported, we got a bigger object that then had the object inside of that.
And the key is coming from that dot object?
Coming from this, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So you could only do dot object once?
So, oh, like this right here?
Yeah, is that you're setting an arbitrary name for a key?
No, I could set this multiple times. So I could set, let's say I did that. I could do exports.number equals 5, and now we should have a new, rather than just having this object with name, now we should have number, and then inside there 5.
I mean the dot object though, right? So that's an arbitrary name you just came up with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't.
Same with number, it could be computer if you want.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So if you guys can see this down here, now we have this bigger object, has object inside of it, and now it also has this number property that's been assigned to that number. So if I want to export multiple things from one file, that's one way to do it, is we can just say exports dot each thing that I want to export, like that. And then if
They
I'm
all
back,
end up in one big object.
correct. Yeah, so this is entirely identical to us just saying module.exports equals, this object, or a bigger object that has this inside of it and then has a number property set to 5.
And just as like an experiment, so does Node or JavaScript look at a JavaScript file as another object itself? So could you just require a file and without exporting anything and then somehow be able to access everything inside of it?
No, if you don't explicitly export something, then no, it's not going to export anything. So I can require a file that say runs a bunch of code.
And then will that code run once you require it?
It will run, but it won't actually export anything unless I explicitly export it. So either using module.exports or exports dot whatever the property.
So it's looking for a specific export in there, and it's not just going to like give you the entire file then, which you can then
Nope.
try. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions about this? Are we pretty good on exporting? So this will become quite important for you guys as you complete the upcoming assignments. And it's also going to be very important for us here as we start to modularize how our code looks. We're going to be using module.exports quite a bit. So let me just get out of there real quick. We'll dump this. Okay. And then I will quickly, let's see, remove with recursive force subdir. Gone. All right. So let's talk about what we're gonna modularize here. The first thing that we're gonna do, and I've got open in the platform here, this thing. It's sort of the directory setup that we're looking to recreate. So we're looking to have a client directory, and then underneath that we want to have a static folder, which is just going to be for your styles and things like that. And then we'll have a views folder, which is going to be for all of our EJS stuff. Then we're going to have a server folder that has a config directory, a controllers directory, and a models directory. All right. So the first thing that we'll do is to just kind of flesh this out a little bit, actually create our structure. So again, we've got a server folder. We've got a client folder. Whoops, not supposed to be in there. Okay, and inside that client folder, we're going to have the static files, and then also our, darn it, I keep doing that within that. And then we're going to have our views as well. Then inside of our server folder, we're going to have this config directory. And then we're also going to have controllers. Remind me what controllers do, guys? Very good. Yeah, exactly. So we use our controllers to run the business logic of our application. And then we've got a models folder too, where we're going to house all of our models. So inside of our config is where we're going to be putting our routes. And let me go back here to show that real quick. So there are going to be a couple files that we put inside of our config folder here, the mongoose file, and then our routes.js. So let's start with the routes. We'll just create that file, routes.js. All right, and what I want to do is actually bring in all the routes that I have from here thus far. So let's just grab all this code here. Oh, can't seem to grab it. Okay, there we go. Whip it out. Something should probably break, no? Or not? Because now I'm just listening with no routes at all. So really our front end wouldn't work. So if I go back into this routes here, let's paste these in. Is that going to work? I mean, would we be able to go to the index route at this point? Probably not, right? Okay. So let's make it work though. So what we want to do is we want to actually export something from this file so that the main server file can use it. And what I want to do, as we were talking about, is we're going to go module.exports equals something. What do you think I might want to export from this? So we have a couple different routes. How might we want to export those? Same as variable, okay. There's kind of a fancier way that we're going to do it, and it may not make sense to you guys right off the bat, but I'm just going to kind of walk you through it, and you'll see how this works. Instead of saving it to a variable and exporting that, we're going to export a function. And the reason why we're going to export a function is because, as you notice here, we need to have reference to this app variable. But where is that app variable currently? It's in the server file. Yeah, exactly. So if we export a function that accepts some app variable, we'll be able to do something with that app variable inside this file. So as I said, it's going to be a little bit tricky and confusing probably when you see it the first time. I'm going to export a function that takes in an app and then applies these routes inside of the body of the function. So when we invoke the function, we're going to have access to that app that we need access to in order to add routes to it. All right, so let's bring all of this code up in here, down inside here. So is this kind of clear? We're exporting just a function. We're not invoking the function or anything. I'm just exporting the function as it is. Does anybody have any questions or clarifications about that? No? Okay, good. Now let's save this, and then back in our server file, we have reference to this app variable currently. So let's do something with it. So let's require our, and again, to get to that, we're going to go inside of our server directory, and then inside of our config, we've got our routes. Now, what am I going to do with that require? What did that require give me? Function. It gave me a function that I can now invoke. So we're essentially going to do just that. We're going to take the function that we just got back from our routes file, and we're going to invoke that against this app variable that we have. Okay. There's still going to be an issue in here, and I'll kind of explain what the problem is here. But what's happening with Dojo? Do we have a reference to that anywhere here? No, Dojo, this capital Dojo, the Dojo model, we don't yet have reference to that. So let's try loading up our front page and see what's happening here. There we go. So we got Dojo is not defined, just as we expected, right? So how do we get Dojo defined? We're going to need to bring in some of the code that we had from our server file to do that. So inside here, we got our Dojo just by laying out the schema here, but we don't necessarily want to bring this whole thing into our routes file. What we want to do is we want to have this be in our models folder. So let's go in and create an actual Dojo model. Let's call this dojo.js. And I'm going to bring all of this code in here. So we're creating a Dojo schema, and then we're registering that as a model. So I'll rip that out, and there we go. We've got some breakage. So Dojo schema, what do we need to require inside here? Can you guys tell? Mongoose. Yeah, very good. So if I go back up in here, in order for us to have reference to this variable, or const in this case, mongoose, I need to actually bring it in. Same thing down here. Okay. So let's just require it. Require mongoose. Okay, good. And let's see what went wrong. So here, schema hasn't been registered for model Dojo. So back in our routes here, we're well, we haven't even gotten there yet. But basically, when we're running these routes, we have to have reference to the Dojo model. And if I were to bring in mongoose here, oops. To get a reference to that model, what we're going to do is we're just going to say const dojo equals mongoose.model, and then you're going to get the Dojo model. And things probably still aren't working as we expect. So again, the schema hasn't been registered for model Dojo. And if I look back in here, we haven't yet required our model, which means that Mongoose itself doesn't yet know about our Dojo schema. So back here in our modularization, the first thing that we wanted to do was get those routes out of there. But in order to make that happen, you can see that there are some other changes that we still need to do. Okay, the first thing that we're going to want to do is we actually have to bring in the code that's going to get all of our models. And we haven't really written this yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to require a file that we will write, and that's going to be inside of our server directory, and it'll be inside of our config. It's going to be our mongoose file. And I don't want you guys to get this confused with the actual module mongoose that we're using is going to be different than this file that we'll create. Our mongoose file that we create is going to do just some of the basic things for us. It's going to grab all of the models that we're going to need, and it's going to run that code so that then when we need to access those models later in our code, we actually have the access to them. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's not there yet. Yeah, sorry. That was the thing. I was saying that's what we're going to create. So inside of our config here, let's just create this mongoose file. And again, the distinction here is that this is our code. This is not mongoose itself. So don't get confused about that. It's just the basic code that we want to run so that we're going to have access to our models. Okay? So inside of mongoose itself, we need to require mongoose. And one thing that I'm gonna put inside of there, although I think Eduardo wasn't doing it quite this way, is I'm gonna put our connection logic inside of our mongoose file as well. But this is kind of like a personal preference for you guys. So if I'm here, see how we're connecting to mongoose here? I can strip this whole thing out and do this from within this mongoose file that we're writing right now. So if I come in here, I'm now running my connection from inside a different file. Yeah, like the connect part, the reason why I don't really want to put that in our server file is because then in the server file I have to require mongoose. Just for this one thing, just so I can connect. But why not have it here inside of our mongoose file? You know, it seems like it's a better place for it, but not a big deal if you do it the other way. So again, back to our server, you'll see here that we're requiring this specific file. So we're going into the server directory, into the config directory, and then requiring that mongoose file, which means that it's going to run all the code that's in that mongoose file. And mongoose is not defined inside of our server file because I've already taken it out. But so the other thing that we're going to do inside of our mongoose file is we're going to require whatever models that we need. Okay. What was the model that we're doing with this project? This is our Dojo project. Yeah, it's just a Dojo model. So we did create the Dojo model file. So let's just require that up here. So I'll say const, actually hold on one second. Let's just require it down here. So after we've connected mongoose, let's just require, we're going to go out one level, and that's why I'm doing the double dot. So we want to go out and then into the models. And then go to Dojo itself. Okay, so we still have an error here, and that's mongoose is not defined, and this is happening inside the server. So if we look up at, this is line 6, we're still trying to do something with the Dojo model inside server, but we actually don't need to because we've moved our routes out. So let's get rid of that. Okay, and now we're pretty much back to where we started. So let's make sure that things are working as expected. We're back to where we were. So we've got our routes fully removed from server.js. Let's keep going with our modularization because we're not fully finished yet. But if I go back into, so there's something on the platform they're going to show you, and I'll touch on this briefly. It's a way that we can grab all of our models in one swoop without referencing them individually by name. And sometimes that's going to come in handy if you have multiple models. Now in our case we just have one, so it's easier, I think, to just require that individual file. But let me just show you real quick how we can grab them all. Should be in here somewhere. Modular MD. I don't know where it went. It's in there somewhere. Yeah, you guys will come across it, so I don't think that we need to like search around for it. But basically what it'll do is, rather than just requiring an individual file, you're going to establish where your models. I'll just show you what it is because I know what the code is. I just don't know where to find it on the platform. So we need to make use of a module that we've used before. It's called FS. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set a model's path. So we'll say the model's path equals the current directory that we're in, plus we're going to go out one level and then into models. Oops. If I could spell it. There. Okay, so that's our model's path, and then what we want to do is we're going to do this method called read dir sync. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to take in a path and just read all the files that are in that specific path. Okay, so if I pass in my model's path, it should give me an array of files, assuming that there are some files in it. It would give me an empty array if we had an empty folder. But so what I'm going to do is just for each through those files. So for each file, some of you guys may or may not have seen the Foreach function, but it basically means we can run a function against every single item in that array. So we'll just check to see if that file is a JS file, then we want to require it. So if file has an index of .js and that is greater than -1, meaning that .js appeared in the file name somewhere, then we want to require it.
So this is just going to return a string or an array of strings that is the file name.
Correct. Yeah, it's gonna. That's exactly it. So we'll have an array back of file names. Okay. So if that particular file that we're looking at this time has a .js in it, let's just require it because that means that it's one of our models. All right. So we'll do require, and then I'm going to do attach the model's path, and then I'm going to tack on a /, and then tack on the name of the file.
Quick question about like the slashes and stuff.
All right.
This would then, can't you have issues if you're using it on like different operating systems?
Well, that's why we're using dir name up here.
Got it. Okay, so that's
That was the whole point of that, yeah. So that we don't run into an issue where, you know, it knows where to find things on your machine but not somebody else's.
But with the slash though, isn't that syntax like changing? Potentially change, like if it's a / or a backslash, or would that change depending on like?
Node shouldn't have an issue with that.
Okay.
At least as far as I know.
Okay.
Yeah. If any Windows users do have any issues with that, let me know. see, but no, I don't think so. Shouldn't be a problem.
Because I think like in Python they have a specific method where they join, where instead of doing a slash, you just give like the directory name and then like a string, and then it'll automatically combine them with slash.
And there are ways that we can do that in here if we wanted to bring in the path module.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so that has some different options. We can use path.join or path.resolve.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all
same kind of thing.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this should be okay. And then if I just comment this out here, we're still okay there, and then we should still be all right on the front end. Oops. Okay, still good on the front end. So all we did there is we just said if there's, if there's at least one file inside of our models path, let's just require it. Okay, and as I said, you guys will come across that code inside the platform, so so don't worry about like, oh, I need that code and I won't see it again. You'll see it again. So it's in there. Okay. Where else do we need to add some things? So we don't have any controllers yet. That's pretty much the only thing that, well, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
JS or JS as the file type, and how do you can you just type in Dojo and then type Dojo.js file?
Oh, you mean like because I didn't say .js at the end of that? Ah, okay. So Node is automatically going to resolve files that have a .js ending on them. So you can do it like this as a shorthand. So I'm really looking for the dojo.js file.
But EJS file, it doesn't. You need to
Well,
set it.
well, with EJS, we're not actually going to require them in this kind of way anyway. All we're doing with EJS is we're saying I want my render or my view engine to be EJS, and then when I think I see what you're saying though. Yeah, we could call EJS templates when we're saying render, res.render. We can call them without the .ejs extension. Have you tried that before?
Yeah.
Because it does work. You can
You
do that
set
too.
it, or it's just automatically recognized by the system.
It's doing it automatically because you're setting it to be your view engine to be EJS. So that's why when EJS knows how to resolve EJS files, so if you just say render index without the .ejs, it'll know what to look for.
One more question. When you connect to the Mongo database,
Yeah.
after localhost, doesn't matter what do you put?
Well, after the localhost has to be the name of the individual database that you're using for that particular project.
I saw you change the name of it.
Did I?
And it doesn't
When,
match
today
the
or
model
yesterday?
name. Yesterday. And then it doesn't match the model name because the model name is Dojo, and then your after localhost you put Mongoose demo.
Yeah, so well, those are two different things. So the one thing, the Mongoose demo, that was the name of the database itself. The model is something different. The model is just going to be specific to one collection inside the database. So I could have multiple models in the project that were all being, or I could have multiple collections inside of my database, like if I had dojos and then I had students or something like that. Does that make sense? The one thing, the Mongoose demo that you saw, that was the name of the database. And then Dojo is just the name of one particular model. So yeah, I can have multiple models in the project. Okay, any other questions about where we're at so far? Because, yes?
In the route folder we looked at, we had a function that had a parameter after the export, and then we passed, when we went to the server page that called the routes, we passed it after the export function.
Correct, yeah.
So export just to that's a callback function inside of that one. What that is?
Is this a callback? Is that what you're saying? When we export this thing?
Once it's been exported, so you
Okay, server.
And you put express into that parameter. Is express the callback function inside of the function that we made on the routes? That.
I wouldn't really call this a callback function. It's just I've sort of done two things in one step, and it might maybe make it more clear if I broke it up. So instead, what I could do is I could say const routes equals requiring the routes, and then oops. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to invoke the routes function against that app that I have.
Express knows what, like express is we don't get to see what express does because that's just something we require. But that will bring it to the server then?
Yeah, what that's going to do is it's going to allow Express to attach those specific routes to our application. Okay, because our routes are now inside of the routes file itself. All right. Now back inside the routes, because this is where we're not quite modular yet. We've got some methods inside here. So our routes are kind of doing more than we want them to do. We want to have these controllers which control, as we said before, the business logic of the app. So I've created a folder for our controllers. Let's actually create a Dojos controller. And now what I want to do is I want to just have, instead of these big functions here, I want to have something like app.get / is going to be some method, like let's say, we'll just say Dojos controller .index method. Okay. Now obviously this won't work right now because we haven't referenced the Dojos controller, but that's ultimately how we want it to look. It's just a nice clean one line of code. When we hit the index method, we're just going to run, or I'm sorry, when we hit the index route, we're going to run the index method. Okay. So here inside of our routes file, we're actually going to need to tap into that Dojos controller in order to be able to do this kind of thing. So we've created it now. Let's require it. So we'll say Dojos controller, and we'll require, we need to go up one level, so outside the config, and then we need to go back into our controllers folder, and then we're going to go to our Dojos controller. Okay, and again, it's still not going to work because inside of our Dojos controller, we haven't yet exported anything, right? So what do you think we want to export? Probably an object. It's an object that's going to have multiple methods for us to use. So in this case, we're just going to have an index and a create method. Those are the only two that we're using thus far. So let's say index. And what our index is going to be exactly the same function that we have inside here currently. So I can literally rip this out of here. And tap it in. Now what's the problem? Do I have a reference to Dojo yet? Anyone? No, not yet, right? So how do I get that reference? I got to bring that in, and then I need to reference. In order to get it, I have to say mongoose.model Dojo. And then back here in the routes, now that we actually have an index method, I'm going to get rid of this and just use that. All right, so it looks like we don't have any errors anymore. Let's just keep refreshing and make sure that it's all right. It's still good. Yes, question?
Would you be able to remove the mongoose references in this file?
Yeah, ultimately we will be able to do that. That's correct. Yeah, I hadn't done it yet because we still have this post route in here, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. So then the other thing that we want to do is we want to create that create method. which we have in here. So again, I can rip out this function body and go back inside the Dojos controller. And then again, I'm just creating a big object, so I put a comma in here, and then the next property I want to export is this create function, like that. And then back in here, since I now have a create method, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So Dojos controller, and then create. So now that, as Rigel was saying, now that we actually don't need, you can see this variable became kind of light colored. That just means that we're not using it. So I can get rid of all of this stuff. I don't need Mongoose anymore because I don't need this model anymore at all. I just need my controllers. That's it. All right. And if we refresh the page, everything's still working. I can still add a location. I'm just going to make some stuff up here, New York. All's still well. The only thing that we haven't really done is we haven't stuck our views inside the inside this client side. But what I can do is I can take this view that we have and I can move it in here. And then inside of our server file, when we said where are our views, we just said they're /views. I could just change that so they're inside /static/views. And then I'll get rid of this top level directory as well. Oh yeah, I do. You're right. Good catch. Failed to look up view index and views directory, so we went to client static views. Oh, it wasn't inside static, it was just inside client/views, right? Okay. All right. So that was the entirety of modularization. We moved the routes outside of our server.js. We moved the models into their own place. We moved the controllers into their own place. And then we kind of gave client its own spot where we could do our static files and also our views as well. Any final questions on how this whole thing works? I know it's kind of a lot to take in, and it will make more sense as you guys practice with it more. I'm sure it's confusing the first time. Yes?
This is a question specifically about this when we've done modularization previously, but more generally speaking, when we get started with a new language or whatever, there's always a recommendation to test as you go.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels really hard to test code when you're breaking it up like this.
I know.
You have to get so many things set up before you can test it. Do you recommend essentially doing what you did, where you build a small version of it, make it work, then break it out into other places, and if it still works, go from there?
I think once you get comfortable with the modularization, you can probably do it as you go. So as you're building the thing, just put the things in the right locations.
Right.
Don't make it one way and then
Right.
remake it, because you're gonna add a bunch of time and energy to it.
Right. Okay.
On that note, would you be allowed to upload this completed thing to maybe your GitHub or something so we can look at the entire completed routes and just be able to reverse it?
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome.
Yeah, okay. Great idea. All right. And then your end of day goal, I think we talked about that. That's the, it's the RESTful Task API. And then I think later on today at 3, we're going to do a message demo. Okay? You got it.